around thinking about how not so much overlaying the mathematics on nature, but looking to nature as teacher of mathematics and trying to think about how land and place can teach us more about how we might want to rethink our responsibility to Earth in order for us to be a better, human on Earth. So helping us kind of rethink that relationship. And how might nature help us do that? And nature does so many things we should be doing, like doesn't waste anything. It's very efficient and sustaining for the continuation of life. So that's a really exciting direction to take that might help think more about what we need certainly for this future and how we can start thinking about that in very early grades by getting kids out on the land, getting them to think about what they're noticing, the patterns they're noticing, how they make sense of the world through the mathematics.
Ooh, that is weird. I think it's really important that you set up a learning environment where we feel the safety and a sense of belonging before we can explore larger issues. And so it's really important to get a sense of every student's identity, to have conversations about facets of who they are, thinking specifically about their experiences, thinking specifically about their connections to the exact place that they live or places that they belong to and the land on which they live and learn and what connections they have to them before we can actually start to explore and build learning.
The measurement is 60.
And one of the things that we've really been working on is connecting students to the land and waters around them and understanding place and that connection between place and community and culture and language and really building up students' ethic of care too around the world around them and the environment. So there's all sorts of things layered in here. But for mathematics, one example, I was in a grade 1-2 classroom and we looked at different maps and different representations of the lands and waters. We didn't realize Richmond was comprised of 19 islands. And then students created their own maps of Richmond. We cut them out of felt and painted them. And then we brought in animals and plants that the students had seen in their local area. And so then they created stories. And we paused partway through that story creation experience to talk about where's the math in your story? How are your characters using math in their daily lives? What issues or problems could be explored through mathematics? And so one of the students was doing a salmon story up the river, and they were talking about ways to measure the pollution and how that was affecting the life cycle of the salmon. Another student created a farm setting, and we have many farms here in Richmond still, and they talked about the different parts of the farm and how much food they would need to grow to feed their family for a year, and all the sort of mathematics that goes into that. So those are just some examples of, sort of weaving in that understanding of place and community and having students connect mathematics to the world around them.
Everything has a story, and then stories are important. And that there are protocols and there are ways that we can use story in really, really meaningful ways and be good learners. And that it's just such a natural fit with this idea of then math being that helper to help the storyteller have that voice that we can now hear the story.
When planning to teach math, when we always think about, the curriculum and the boxes, but I always also try to take a more holistic approach. And so when I'm planning out a year, I usually use a circle as a frame. So where are we going to start? Where are we going to end? I always try to start as local as we can, especially when we're looking at the land and bringing in local stories and understanding the place where we do live and reside and whose land we're on. If we're going to start with this is us and this is where we are, and how do we go around in that circle, and at the end of the year I would usually say to students, so what have we learned about the place where we are? And so then they can draw in all those stories and connections. So this is what we knew about where we are. This is where we are today. What have we learned? What do we know? What can we tell someone else about this place?
Stories and narrative are really important to math learning because learning is about identity and story is about identity. So the kids really feel that connection to their math when they're telling their own stories about the math that lives in that place. And then it really gets back to these provocations, which are so central, which we need to be asking all the time, right? Is where does math live in what we're doing? Where does it live outdoors? Where does it live in art? Where does it live in construction? Because it's only by connecting math to the rest of the world that we're really using math as the tool that it's meant to be used.
Well, I think of the communities and the different communities that my kids are in, and try to think of something that works for all of them. when I took the kids to see Arlene Ness, who was carving a totem pole, she also talked about starting her own business as an artist, and she brought in every big idea in the workplace: data, stats, perspective, finance. She spoke to every big idea in the curriculum.
So today, our lesson was out in the forest, but we had practiced a lot of the things with fractions beforehand, and we had practiced identifying trees beforehand. So today was kind of a really cool, almost summary to see what their skills are with creating fractions, adding fractions together, and splitting them up, and comparing fractions. That all came after we identified our trees. Before we went out today, I had created a worksheet specific for us. We had done some background learning on trees, lessons about biodiversity, identifying trees. We talked about how it's important to have different kinds of trees in an area, especially when we are in a community that's really reliant on logging, and what happens when they log an area, and when they plant the trees, they just plant all of one kind instead of all the different kinds, and all the effects of that. So we've had a lot of background kind of lessons to go with this particular math lesson, and lots of lessons about fractions. So today, when we went outside, their job was to identify trees and tally every tree that they found. So they were making a tally for every pine tree, every fir, every spruce, and birch trees, and aspen trees. And after we came back to our classroom, we used that information that we found about the trees to write some fractions, to compare fractions of what we noticed. Were there more deciduous trees or coniferous trees? And there was a question about, like, does our forest represent biodiversity, and how did you know that it represented diversity?
I think the big thing about trying to decolonize my math classroom is getting away from pencil and paper and worksheets. The kids are up on the whiteboard, or they're working on a big sheet of paper, or they're writing on lockers and windows, and they're thinking together, and they're sharing their ideas with one another. And then we'll stop and we'll have story time. Like, what does this remind you of in your real life? Like, where might you use it? Or what are you thinking about? And they start telling stories about how they've used this concept, or how this concept might have been helpful. An example might be, we were talking about the Pythagoras ratio, the 3, 4, 5, and one of the kids like, oh, we're putting up a tent, and you know the middle pole, it has to be straight up, and I couldn't figure out how I could make this, I'm trying to think, is this a perfect square or not? And then they go, oh, well, I used my reference. And I went, okay, well, I have this many up this way, and I have that many that way. And I'm like, so you didn't use a ruler? You didn't use, and they're like, no, like I don't need a ruler. It's all about the ratio. And I'm like, oh my God, this is so powerful. And the kids are like, this is how my grandpa would have done it. And we talk about, well, how was it done before? Like, how did they do it before you had calculators, before you had tools to measure and things? And honoring that indigenous knowledge and ways of doing it. And then talking about the kids that these are really great ways, and they're the precursors to a lot of the things that we do now. And what we're doing now, the way that we're changing it up, is not any better. It's just a little bit more efficient. It's just a little bit more precise maybe. But in a world that we live in, very little is precise. So estimating, being able to be good estimators, being able to use what you have to be able to do that stuff is so important. And then honoring the way that their families have done it in the past, and having the kids share. My kukum, when she measures, she doesn't measure a cup. It's a handful. So it's so many handfuls, and then it's a half a handful, and then it's a pinch. And I'm like, well, what do you think a pinch is? And they're like, well, it's about a quarter of a handful. And so we're talking fractions, and we're talking about things that are relevant to them.
Kids know a lot. I've drawn on so much of their knowledge just to identify plants even. We are constantly foraging. That's what you also saw today. We can eat dandelions, we can eat spruce buds, all of those things. I generally work on a concept in the classroom, and then for every walk we add to it. So if you're doing shapes, you do the typical shape walk in the environment. We've been doing measurement, circumference of trees, those sorts of things. Estimation. Those are all math concepts that are so easily taken outside. We are constantly counting our stairs, counting how many kids we have, using that language, closer, farther, all of that math language is used. So it's really sort of just part of our day. And the kids love it because they see the connection too between what we're doing in the classroom and what we're doing outside.
It's really a challenge to help students build a relationship with math that's emotionally positive. And so trying to build on what students bring with them into the class to help those strengths form a different kind of relationship with math. So they have a different identity. They see themselves as doers of math, as math as something that could be they could pursue as an adventure, like be a mathematical adventurer.